Today's presentation, Introduction to the Beiruti Houses, is hosted by Fadlallah Dagher. He's an architect, member of Beirut Heritage Initiative, and he has been working on the heritage preservation for more than 30 years, and was an advisor at the Ministry of Culture between 1994 and 2016.
Good evening, everyone. As you know, the issue of the Beiruti houses has been discussed for more than 30 years. The question of heritage in Lebanon is still not included in the regulations. So it's not protected, it's not listed. And the heritage of Beirut is in jeopardy because of regulations that are a general master plan that is totally outdated. Of course, it's a political problem. And following the blast on August 4, 2020, it was one of the main problems that we had to face, which was to save whatever was remaining of the Beiruti heritage. This is why the Beirut Heritage Initiative was formed, actually. And we initiated this in order to help raise interest and attention on those Beiruti houses, and of course, raise funds as well to preserve them and work also on the global urban thinking of the city. I will start now with my presentation. So this first presentation today is an introduction to the Beiruti house. I'm sure most of you know a lot about the Beiruti house, and I hope I will be able to bring in some new elements to the discussion. What's mainly to be said about that is that those houses, actually, little has been written about them. Everybody knows them. Everybody knows that these houses are central hall houses. Everybody knows that they have 3 arches on the main facade. Everybody knows that they have a cubical form and pitch tile roof. However, as I've been saying, no real study has been made on these buildings. And following the blast, of course, many of these buildings were severely affected, which allows us today to study them more and more in detail. Okay. So I was saying that the next presentations will focus mainly on the restoration methods that can be used on the Beiruti houses, focusing on the structural part, on the pitched roof and the truss structure of the roof, on the finishes, on the windows and doors, and on the integration of such buildings in the modern urban setting of the city. So to start my presentation, I will start with a map, which is what we call the heritage map. This map was produced in 2014, sorry. It was produced by Abdul Halim Jabr and me as a sort of a strategy for preserving the neighborhoods, the heritage neighborhoods of Beirut, and this was done for the Ministry of Culture and the DGA. Again, the issue here is at the urban level, it's not at the particular buildings level. And the focus on this map was really to look at the heritage, not only what we call the traditional Beiruti house, but at the same time, the Beiruti houses of the late Ottoman period, the buildings of the period between the 2 wars, and the modernist period as well. And so the idea was really to come up with a strategy, a long-term strategy, initiated by the Ministry of Culture to preserve Beirut's heritage. Unfortunately, up until today, as you know, the political system is totally blocked and not willing to look at such issues at all. Lebanon, as you know, is a small country on the Mediterranean. Beirut, to understand Beirut and its architecture, we need to understand the context. The geographic context, first of all, Beirut is backed by mountains, which allows it to be really very well fed in water. And it's, of course, a peninsula into the Mediterranean. It has been one of the major ports in the Roman and Byzantine times. And then its history, starting from 1850, also developed around the port. A small historical overview. In 1800, so Beirut was a small coastal town with defense walls all around, 7 gates, and surrounded by agricultural fields. mainly mulberry fields, because silk from the mulberry was exported to Europe. The population was approximately 5,000 people, and it was the city was under Ottoman rule, under the Emirate of Mount Lebanon rule, at the time the Shahabi Emirate. In 1832, the Egyptians invaded Lebanon, Syria and Palestine as well, and were fighting against the Ottoman Empire, and they established their main camp in Beirut. They moved the capital of the Wilaya of Saida to Beirut at the same time, and the European consulates moved from Saida to Beirut at the time. 1939 is an important date in the Ottoman Empire because it's the time when the Tanzimat started. The Tanzimat regime is an innovation, restoration regime in the Ottoman Empire, which includes modernization of the empire and social liberalization of the empire as well. In 1840, the Ottomans re-established in Beirut. The Egyptians were out. The Ottomans came back with the help of the British Empire, and the port then had been enlarged by the Egyptian, and it was further enlarged by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans wanted at the time to really make a case study of Beirut, to really make it a model of what a modern city of the Ottoman Empire could be. This, of course, benefited to the bourgeoisie of Beirut, the people of Beirut, who had this port which was enlarged. It was the only port on the Eastern Mediterranean that could accept vapor ships, what we call bob-board. Vapor ships were really big ships that could transport goods from Europe to Lebanon, and from Lebanon to the inland, from Beirut to the inland. In 1848, the city started expanding outside its limits, outside the walls. The walls started to be demolished, and the road to Damascus was initiated. The trading, of course, increased. In 1860, the population expanded a lot because there was a lot of migration from the mountains of Mount Lebanon, and from Syria, Damascus and Aleppo, following the upheavals. 1861, Beirut started to be a wilaya itself, so it was established as a wilaya, and at the same time, the whole Arab region in the Ottoman Empire went through a cultural revival, what we call Al-Nahda. In the 1870s, the Western educational missions established in Beirut, the American College, Université Saint-Joseph, and the Patriarchal College. And this is important because, of course, we have a growing population. This population is going to get educated, and educated by the Western cultural institutions. In the 1890s, the railroad tracks connect Beirut to the inland, to Damascus, and through Damascus to Baghdad and Persia. So it enhances more and more the commercial routes through Beirut, which means more prosperity to the city. So in 1900, the population had gone up from 5,000 to 125,000 people. 1914, World War I, and then in 1920, Beirut is the capital of Greater Lebanon under the French mandate. This historical overview is just to give an idea of what Beirut went through the 19th century and why Beirut is so important and why it became the capital of Lebanon versus two major cities, which were Saida and Tripoli, which were much more important in the early Ottoman times and, of course, before that. So Beirut, during the 19th century and at the turn of the 20th century, is the major city on the Levant. And this is a map produced in 1876, the famous map of Julius Leutwerd for the Sultan Abdul Hamid, which shows the historical city in pink in the center of the image, the whole peninsula of Beirut, and the expansion of the city outside the city walls with the major institutions. And here we can see how the city expanded. It expanded mainly on two major axes: the road to the south, which is the Saida Road in red, the road to the north, which is the Tripoli Road in yellow, east and north, and eventually the road to Damascus, which was opened in the 1850s in green. So this was the road on which the city expanded in the second half of the 19th century. As we said, the Tanzimat were established in 1839, and it had a big impact on the society and at the same time on architecture. The impact on the socio-economics, the capitulations which were signed by the Ottoman Empire with the Europe opened the empire to the Europe traders. The religious and cultural institution from the West established in Beirut. The Tanzimat opened the whole possibilities to the non-Muslim communities as well as the Muslim communities. So everybody got access to citizenship, political rights, land ownership, and free trade, which also benefited a lot to the non-Muslim bourgeoisie of Beirut. So the bourgeoisie of Beirut in the East Mediterranean is the East Mediterranean pivot of 19th century open markets, economic prosperity, industrial era, Western social and cultural influence. Now, on the architectural impact, because of the security, when the Ottomans came back in 1840, the security in Beirut and around Beirut allowed for the expansion of the city, and suburban villas started to be built around the city. A new architectural type appeared, both centered and extraverted. So it's centered on its central hall. It's somehow inspired by the earlier Liwan type and central courtyard type buildings. But it's extraverted at the same time because through the triple arch and the balconies, the house expands to the outside. It's inspired by Western and Stambuli types. Economic prosperity is expressed through industrial imported building material, finishes, and decorative styles. On the urban planning, the impact here is that the Tanzimat, there was a series of laws, of urban laws, which were edicted, through which the streets were widened and made straight to adapt to the modern carriage traffic. The building heights were set at 12 meters, then later on at 15 meters, which explains a little bit the elevations of the Beiruti houses, which generally the first grand villas of the suburban area had 12 meters in height, 2 times 6 meters. Each floor had 6 meters in height, and then 12 meters at a total with 2 floors. And then later on, when 15 meters were allowed, we had apartment buildings of 15 meters with 3 times 5 meters in height. At the same time, fire safety regulations were established, public health regulation, and public water supply, which also, of course, benefited a lot to the city. So the buildings were set out on an organic grid, mainly facing north. Why? Because 2 things. Because first of all, the Beirut hills are coming down to the sea on the northern side. Also, north is where in all the east, from Syria, Persia, Iraq, or even Lebanon, etc., this is where all the houses were open to. The Liwans, the main hall of the houses, were open to the north in order to avoid the sunlight. So the family suburban villas extended on 2 levels with high ceilings. Actually, they were built earlier in phases, as we will see later on, and they will extend on 2 levels in time. Then new commercial apartment buildings will appear at the end of the century, starting from 1880. These apartment buildings were built to be let on 3 or even sometimes 4 levels, with retail at grade level and residential typical apartments above. Kitchen structures were added with vaulted masonry fireproof ceiling. This was one of the conditions of the Tanzimat to avoid fire. Now, actually, this was mainly the fire regulations, fire safety regulations were edicted for Turkey, where a lot of timber structure exists. However, in Lebanon, it was adapted to mainly the kitchen, which were always vaulted and were added on to the initial structures. WCs were added next to the kitchen with a sewage channel leading to a septic tank. And then, of course, because public water was supplied, private garden fountains appeared, sinks inside the buildings, wash basins, etc. So all of it, of course, increased the public health inside those houses. The architectural type of the Beiruti house is inspired from many places. Initially, the main model would be the Sasanian Iwan, which dates back to the 5th and 6th century. And then it inspired the Islamic architecture, the Islamic world, through Persian architecture and the whole Islam, and local tradition in vernacular mountain architecture, where the Diwan house is one of the main vernacular houses of the mountains. It's also inspired from Ottoman 18th and 19th centuries domestic architecture. At the time, of course, because the Ottoman Empire got richer and the population got richer, there was a huge building of residential houses, domestic houses in all the Ottoman Empire, mainly in Turkey, with some inspiration from Italy. At the time, in the 18th century and 19th century, many Italian architects started working in Istanbul. And of course, the Ottoman style changed into more Europeanized style. Now, influence from the West came through the Northern Mediterranean Renaissance and classical models. Venice, of course, with its symmetry, the central hall palazzos. Here we can see the famous Iwan Kusra, which is a Sasanian palace of the 6th century in Iraq. We see the central Iwan, which was the central hall of this palace. And to the right, you can see the vernacular farmhouse of the Mount Lebanon, which is very similar, of course, at a very different scale, but very similar. And the Iwan is always oriented to the north in order to avoid the sunlight. Here we can see Ottoman models of the 18th and 19th century, the Ahmed III library with its centralized plan. It has a central hall surrounded by Iwans in the shape of a T, 3 arches on the facade. In the middle, you see a Yali on the Bosphorus. Look at the plan. The plan of the Yali shows you very well how it's centralized, also on a T shape with Iwans on the side. And then to the right, we have 2 houses, central hall houses in Turkey, which also explain the influence of those plans. At the same time, another influence comes from Venice, the Venetian Renaissance architecture. So the centrality imposed by Palladio through Renaissance, and then later on, of course, all the palaces of the Grand Canal in Venice, which in their elevation somehow can recall the Beiruti house with the central opening in the center, the sides windows, and this central opening in the Gothic style will give inspiration to the decoration of the central 3-arched bay of Beiruti architecture. So now we move into this Beiruti architecture, which of course most of you know or have seen. The characteristic of what we know today is globally a square house with a pitched roof, tiled pitched roof, and the north facade opens with 3 large arches, the 3-arched bay, with decoration made out of wood inside, glazed, totally open with a balcony on the outside, on the side of the garden or the streets, overlooking the streets. These houses actually, we know very little because nothing has been really written about it. There is, of course, the famous Raguet book, which talks of it, but does not talk of how it does not give sources. It gives hints of how it was evolved. It evolved from earlier models. And the book of Robert Saliba that focuses more on the architecture of the transitional period between 1920 and 1940. But we know very little on the evolution and the appearance of the Beiruti house because we have no written evidence of this period at the time. We have pictures, of course, lots of pictures, but little written evidence that says how this model evolved, how it was implemented. What we know it from analysis and research of historical buildings. Here, for instance, is one building that I have worked on, and because I have renovated this building, I was able to really analyze the evolution of its model from the early cell, which is phase one, the vernacular module, a centrally one type made out of 3 rooms and only one oriented north. Then the phase 2 was the addition of a vaulted kitchen and WC. And here, how we are able to know that these phases, how to identify those phases, it was done at the same time, identification on the site through the connections in the architecture, in the masonry, and made an analysis through the Ottoman cadastral plans, cadastral description, and she was able to reconstitute the evolution of the building as detailed in the Ottoman cadastre. And we, of course, we analyzed this with the construction. So phase 2, addition of vaulted kitchen and WC. Phase 3, 2 wings, east and west, are added on the sides of the Iwan to create a central courtyard. And then this central courtyard will be closed by 3 arches on the northern facade. A ceiling will be added on top, and then an upper floor will be added to not only to enlarge the house, but mainly to benefit from the views to the sea, to benefit from fresh air. And very particular detail here, as you can see, the central hall is elevated. It has round windows on the side for ventilation and light as well. And the small pitched roof appears on top of it. Later on, the pitched roof will be enlarged and will cover the whole building. So the phases here, which are actually confirmed by what we observed on the building, can be confirmed also by pictures of the period. Here are all pictures from 1860 and 1870, 1872, where we can see many models that really resemble the house that we have seen before. So the model evolves little by little to eventually, of course, we will reach the traditional classical central hall house. Here we can see pictures to the left of this first Iwan module on the top, and below one house that is still existing today, a vernacular house, farmhouse, which is still existing today in the Sagesse area. And to the right, a page from the book of Robert Saliba, Beirut, 1920-1940, Domestic Architecture Between Tradition and Modernity, where Robert describes the evolution from the vernacular type to the classical central hall type, and then to the great mansion, supra-vernacular mansion of Beirut. Now, so this Beiruti central hall plan, classical plan, is centered on the central hall. To the south, on the bottom, you can see there is a Liwan with 2 rooms on the side. This is the original module. Then this module extends with wings on the sides around a central hall, which later on extends also to the north with one hall that extends the central hall, which is called the Diwan Khanum, which is the ladies' space, because it's to the north. It's a fresh space, largely open through the 3 arches to the garden. So also it has a nice view over the garden or over the streets. And so the ladies can sit in this area and interact with the city and with the garden. To the left, so on the eastern side, but sometimes on the western side, it depends. Here it's on the western side in this plan. The Salam Lake, which is the reception hall, it's a salon that is also very much decorated, and it's open to the visitors. And on the other sides, we have bedrooms, actually rooms that are multi-purpose, can serve to sleep or as offices or as dining rooms. And after the Tanzimat, the kitchen is added to those buildings. What is interesting is that if you look at those buildings from outside, there are codes that allow you to date the buildings or to understand the evolution of the plan. Because whenever the kitchen volume is added on, it means if it's protruding, it means that it was not conceived initially and it was an addition. So the building has evolved through time. It started as a smaller footprint, and then it evolved through time. The same thing happens with the stairs. Whenever the stairs are added from the outside, it means that the building was first of all built on one level, the ground level, and then later on a second level was added, and the stairs had to be added with it. So the kitchen is always located on the eastern side. Why? Because the prevailing winds come from the southwest in Beirut, and so smells from the kitchen will be taken out on the eastern side. Again, the kitchen is vaulted. Why? Because it's fireproof, it's vaulted in stone, and next to the kitchen, in mainly most of the buildings, one of the small on the columns of one of the corner columns is carved out, and a WC is added inside. Why is it next to the kitchen? Because it has one channel that connects the kitchen and the WC to an underground vaulted septic tank. And outside the kitchen, there is always a well, because all these houses were suburban houses. And because they are suburban houses, there was no water supply. So the water was supplied through wells, and we will talk about the wells later on. The main features of these houses, of course, the central hall, which is the image at the left bottom, the Salamlik, the reception hall, which is at the left top, the Diwan Hanum, the ladies' room, which is the photo is to the right at the top, and the vaulted kitchen to the right at the bottom. The Liwan, which is also a sitting room, very well ventilated because it has windows facing each other on the east and the west sides, is to the back of the central hall. You can see it in the photo, in the image at the bottom left. So the kitchen, the vaulted kitchen, and the sanitary were connected through a channel, and the channel is in the center below. A channel to septic tanks. The septic tanks were vaulted rooms and were regularly cleaned by specialized people. And all these suburban houses were able to sustain because they were fed by wells. The name of Beirut, the city, actually comes from Beirut, which means the wells. It's the plural of Beir, and each and every house in the neighborhood of Beirut, in the suburban area, enjoyed a well. The well is not a well to stock water. It's a well to collect water only from underground water, running underground water that came from Ras al-Naba, which is at the level of Nahar Beirut, the river of Beirut, coming from the mountains. The water then gets through the ground, through the marly ground, to the sea, down to the sea. So these wells were dug into the ground to catch this underground water, running water, and feed the buildings and feed the gardens. The water is generally at a level between 12 and 15 meters underground. And the wells were done in a way that someone could go down to clean it or to collect water at the same time. And of course, because water was available, gardens around the houses appeared. The gardens were initially mulberry fields, and then those mulberry fields were turned into gardens. And those gardens were at the same time very nice to look at, with specific plants, of course the jasmine, of course the frangipane, and other flowery trees, but also fruity trees like orange trees, dates, mulberry, of course, almonds, olives. So it was at the same time a garden to enjoy and a garden to feed the people. What is interesting in this Beiruti house plans is that everything is built around the central hall. The central hall is really the typical space that we find in all those houses. And it gives a very strong unity to all these houses, despite major scale differences. Of course, the scale is relative to the social status of the occupants. And here we have a comparison of different plans. And some of these plans have also extended through time. So they started as small buildings. For instance, the Saifi 614, which is the house I showed you in 3D, started as a Liwan house, and then it extended little by little to become a very complex plan. Other houses also started smaller and eventually became a very large bourgeois mansion. But you can see here, so from the smallest to the largest, it's always very strongly centralized. If not, for instance, the second plan, the Mail 339, was stopped before extending more. So eventually, the central hall should have been really centered with rooms all around. So most of these buildings, of course, have the central hall and the rooms around. We can see that sometimes the staircase is integrated within the plan, which means that those buildings were built generally after 1880, when the system, the module of the central hall plan was already established. And so buildings were planned from the start with many levels. To the extreme bottom right, you can see a large mansion, upscale mansion, which also shows, of course, a sort of double symmetry on the south-north axis and on the east-west axis. So many large mansions of the second half of the 19th century show this double symmetrical plan, which is inspired, of course, from Italian models, Palladian models, and was implemented here in Beirut by the very wealthy families. And of course, this unity of the buildings is further expressed in the facade through the central hall, which is expressed by 3 arches on the northern facade. As we can see here, whatever the scale, the buildings globally look the same. These buildings are quite simple, and the social status is expressed through the scale and through the elaboration of the architectural details. We will see some of those architectural details later on. On the urban scale, what is interesting in this Tanzimat is that, as we were saying, the roads were straight, the roads were enlarged, and most of the buildings were built facing north with the 3 arches on the north. So this unity is further reinforced, the unity of the model is further reinforced by the repetitivity of this model at the urban scale. So it's the city was practically very well organized with set heights, set volumes, and set orientations, as opposed to the modern city and the modern regulations, which really didn't give at all any importance to the context, to the sunlight, to the wind, and really these regulations, which were implemented in the 1950s, were implemented without taking care at all of the existing urban fabric or whatever was previously existing. And this explains, in a way, why it's so difficult today to preserve or to find those Beiruti houses from the late Ottoman times, because, of course, regulations allow for a very high building coefficient, but not only, because also the whole parcelization of the city, the opening of new streets, was not made taking into consideration the initial existing fabric. Now we will talk of the formal characteristic and the materials of the Beiruti house. The house you're seeing here was in Ashrafiyeh, and this house was demolished in 1995. When it was demolished, the Ministry of the former Ministry of Culture, which was in charge then, Michel Edde, started trying to implement regulations to preserve those Beiruti houses. So this house, we can see the centrality of the central hall, which is expressed on the facade through the three arches and the balcony. We can see also the material on the lower floor, which is the sandstone of from Site Bay, which was used in the construction. The buildings, we don't know the names of the architects, we don't know the names of the builders, but what we can see is that there is use of harmonic ratios and rules of proportions in this architecture. Many of these ratios are very easy to build on the sites. The square, the intersecting equilateral triangles, you build two equilateral triangles, which allows you to build a rectangle. The Pythagoras triangle, which gives way to a rectangle of 3 modules in height and 4 modules in length. Then this ratio with a semicircle gives another one. The root of 2 rectangle, where the diagonal of the square is used to create a rectangle with a proportion of 1 to 1.4. The 1 to 1.5 ratio, the golden ratio, and the root of 3 rectangle also. So all these rules, which are used in classical architecture, can be found in the houses of Beirut. As you can see, for instance, in this building, the master plan of the building is based on the Pythagoras rectangle with a semicircle added to it, and then each and every room is based on a specific rule of proportion. The Pythagoras rectangle, the root 2, the 2 triangle, equilateral triangles, or the squares. Further analysis of other plans show also the same development, the same modular development, and we see that most of the rooms follow the same proportions. For instance, the Salamlik, which is located at the upper left of the plans, follows the 2 equilateral triangles. The Liwan, which is in the center bottom, is usually following it follows the Pythagoras rectangle. The root of 2 is also very much used, as we said before. And here is an interesting example, which is the Greek Orthodox Archbishopric. It was built in phases. So most of these buildings were built in phases with additions. It was built in phases, with one phase in 1862, which is the top to the left, where you can see the house built on a root of 2 proportion, and the detail of the rooms also follow the rules of proportion that we have seen before. But when the building was extended and to become the Archbishopric siege of Beirut, See of Beirut, it was built on the golden section. So the addition was made in a way that the whole building would follow the golden section, because it's of course a very important buildings. So the proportional ratio, of course, is based on the importance of the building. As for the materials and building components, part of the materials were locally supplied, but many materials were imported from Europe. The locally supplied material was mainly the sandstone, what we call the ramle, coming from Musait Bay, and the marl stone, which is whitish, from Ashrafiyeh. The marl stone of Ashrafiyeh actually was used in the early periods, from between 1840 and 1870, and then later on it was abandoned when Ashrafiyeh was occupied by villas. So at that time, mainly the sandstone was the only major material for building the walls and the vaulting masonry. The limestone, which is harder and stronger, comes from Mansouriye. It was used for posts, lintels, stairs, corbels, floor tiles, wash basins, and sinks. And of course, the lime to fix those stone walls. The lime, the gypsum, the sand, and organic fibers were from locally supplied. But in parallel, as the port of Beirut was really very important and European tradesmen were exporting material, newly developed industrial material from Europe, the imported material was timber, what we call qatrani, which is the Cedrus libani wood coming from the Eastern Ottoman Empire, for ceiling slabs, roofing, windows, and doors. The metals, steel from France and from Britain. We had structural I-beams, balustrades and fences, cast iron balustrades from Great Britain, cast iron pipes of course as well, lead and zinc sheets from the Ottoman Empire and from France, decorative features, drain pipes and gutters, and ironmongery. All of these metals were imported. The Carrara marble, the famous Carrara marble, which all the central halls were tiled in Carrara marble, came from Italy for the posts, the columns of the three arches, the balcony slabs, floor tiles, and in upscale buildings, the stairs and the balcony corbels. The terracotta tiles from France for the roofing, Marseille roof tiles, floor tiles and brick masonry, and finally the glass, which was imported from France and Great Britain for the windows. So as we see, the main structural elements are produced with local material. However, all the decorative elements that give the status of the building will be imported. The sandstone was used for the walls, but sometimes it was kept apparent if it was sandstone of good quality, but most of the time it was plastered, hidden, to protect it from the rain and from the wind. The marl stone is the stone you see in the front on the left, or to your left, which is whitish. It comes from Ashrafiye, and it was sometimes used as alternated courses with sandstone, as you see in the picture to the right. The limestone from Mansouriye was used for the flooring, for the posts and lintel, and for the stairs. All were produced, of course, on site in Mansouriye and brought down to Beirut. So each and every step you can take adapts to different buildings. So they have the same size, same detail, same nose. Really, everything is really identical. The central arch bay windows and balconies were built first using Mansouriye posts, but then using Carrara marble columns that were imported from Carrara, also sculpted in Carrara and imported. The balcony slabs also were cut in Italy and imported to Lebanon, where they were installed. So the central arch bay and the balcony are the typical new element of these facades. It's of course related to the status of the facade, status of the social status of the family. The larger it is, of course, the wealthier the family. The more decorated it is, the wealthier the family. The details of the windows also are very elaborate, with all the designs are built on circles. And this feature of those buildings, the three arches, were very severely affected by the August 4 blast. As you can see in these pictures, many buildings lost their emblematic three arches in the blast. The balcony railings and balustrades were either wrought iron or cast iron. The cast iron came from France or from Great Britain, and the wrought iron from the south of France. And some specific models were produced and that you can find in most of the houses. Now, the construction systems is the bearing walls with slabs, wood or steel slabs, and masonry and arches. The sandstone bearing walls and arches constitute the main bearing structure of the buildings. Sometimes those walls were also tied with steel anchoring, as you can see in the center photo on top. These used to connect the walls together and really give them more strength. So it's some sort of a post-tensioned vertical wall. This will be more explained by Dr. Michel Chelhoub in his presentation next week. The slabs were made out of timber with one major beam and secondary beams and planks on top of it. But the problem here is water infiltration, which of course causes rotten wood beams in time. The second system, which was more in the larger houses, was the jack arch slab. The jack arch slab, it's a system that was implemented in industrial buildings in the early 19th century in Britain, in Great Britain, and then it was exported to the whole world, Iraq, Persia, India, and through Beirut. It is based on I-beams, steel I-beams, with small arches in between that were made out of brick or the local sandstone. As we can see on the photo to the left, we have sandstone arches in between those beams. And to the right, you can see the top of those jack arch slabs, which were connected by steel rods connecting them. So it's masonry filling in between steel I-beams. This was quite efficient because it was more solid than the timber beams and the timber slabs. But of course, in time, the oxidation of the I-beams can cause some problems. All these, the jack arch slab was covered from the bottom with plaster. So it was totally plastered and decorated with very elaborate decoration. The roofing, the pyramidal timber truss and Marseille tiles pitched roof appeared as of 1860. Any photograph before 1860 doesn't show any of those tiled roofs, while after 1860, we start seeing lots of tiled roof. Why? Because these tiled roof, before that, the ceilings were flat. And in all pictures of Beirut, we see flat ceilings that were made of compacted earth on wooden slabs, on timber slabs. But this, of course, erodes in time, and it's very fragile unless it's very well maintained. So the pyramidal pitched roof in Marseille tiles was really an occasion for waterproofing these buildings. And at the same time, of course, it provides a more spectacular facade effect. Here you can see the inside of the timber truss, some houses with the pyramidal roof, and the detail of those tiles, which were carved in, which were industrially produced in Marseille. Here we can see one of the tiles from below with the name of the fabricant, and to the right you can see a symbol which is a bee the B became the typical standard tile of the Beiruti houses, and up until today we say nahle, which means the B is the standard used tile in Lebanon. The roof eaves and cornices were sometimes simple, sometimes much more elaborate, protruding, for instance, outside of the building on corbels. The staircase, as I was saying, the staircases were most of the times added on early structures, because the early structures were built on one level and then they added an upper floor, and so they added the stairs from outside. So whenever you see stairs which is on the side of the building and from outside, it means that the building was extended through time and the stairs is an addition. However, of course, if the stairs are centered on the three arches, it means that the building was originally composed with the building, as you can see on the picture to the top right. Those stairs were mainly produced in the limestone of Mansouriye with the same typical detail, but in upscale buildings it was produced in marble, in Carrara marble, which can be seen in the very large houses. The internal staircases, of course, in the very large mansions, there's always an internal staircase because both floors, the two floors, were connected together and connected with a marble staircase inside, as you can see on the details. But for the service staircase, it was produced in Mansouriye limestone. And whenever the internal staircase is totally recessed within the building, it means that the building was built after 1880. So the plan is very well established. It's established already that it will be on many levels, and the building was built at one stage on 2 or 3 levels with an internal staircase in Carrara, with the landings in Carrara marble and the steps in Mansouriye local stones. And on the outside, again, as I've been telling you, the codes of these buildings are very easy to understand. If you see two arch windows connected together on the facade, it means that behind this, it's the staircase. The symbol of the staircase on the facade are those two arches connected together. Like on the main facade, the 3 arches are the symbol of the central hall. So the sandstone walls were always plastered from outside to protect it from the rain, most of the time, not always, but most of the time plastered to protect it from the rain. And from inside also it was plastered and then painted and decorated. Many houses were painted with lime wash colored in blue from outside, because in the 19th century, the industrial blue color was produced by Mr. Guimet, and he was able to reproduce the blue color of the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, which was very rare. And when it was produced industrially, which we call in Arabic Nil, it was imported, of course, to Beirut and to other regions of the world, and very much used in Beirut to paint and to color the houses of Beirut. So most of the houses were either white because it was lime washed, or white or blue because lime washed with an addition of Nil, of blue color, ultramarine blue, which gave it a very nice color. You can see on the photo to the right some shades of blue that are still existing on the facade. Inside the houses, the walls were always highly decorated, depending also on the social status. The more the social status is high, the more decorated, of course. And of course, because the taste has changed all over those 150 years of time, those paintings were sometimes washed out and covered with other paintings. But this is important to know that most of the time, those initial and early paintings can be still found under the new layers. So if we erase the layers, you can find the initial decoration under all these layers. Of course, the decoration is most of the time from Western origin, Western inspired, and very elaborate, as you can see on those two pictures. So we have panels on the walls. Always there's a plinth on the lower side, then a panel on the wall, then on top of it, a sort of a cornice. When the walls were not, when the partitions were added and not bearing structures, it was added in what we call Baghdadi. Baghdadi is a gypsum wall that is made out of wood lattice and gypsum and lime plaster on it. Of course, those partitions were very light and were also very severely affected by the ban on August 4, 2020. But the Baghdadi was mainly used for ceilings. The last ceiling, the top ceiling of the building, was made of a light structure under the roof tiles. And those ceilings were decorated with plaster decoration, molded plaster, or simply flat with painting, very elaborate paintings on it. Here you can see three different houses, upscale bourgeois houses with elaborate decoration. The decoration varies in all these buildings. In the central hall, the most elaborate, of course, usually is the central hall, but mainly the Salamlik, which is the reception hall. In these three buildings, it's the ceiling which is to the left on the top. As you can see, it's very elaborate in all three buildings. The central hall also is quite elaborate, and the dining hall, which has always very specific decoration, as we will see in the detail. Those Baghdadi ceilings, also, as I was saying, it's plaster and lime applied on wood lattice, with sometimes relief and sometimes it's flat. When it's flat, it's just painted with flowers or with decoration, but most of the time the important rooms are decorated with reliefs of persons, of flowers, of birds, and the themes are always there's always, of course, a central medallion in the center of the room to hold the chandelier, but on the sides you have friezes, and the frieze can be also can show different patterns. What is really interesting is that in the dining hall, it's always decorated with food. So birds, fish, fruit, or for instance, you can see here in the middle, pomegranate and oranges, or watermelon. And on the side, you can see the fish and the birds, and flowers, of course, which were always decorating this. As for the flooring patterns, also there is a systematic flooring system where the central hall is always organized with Carrara marble tiles, which are installed on a diagonal pattern. So the main rooms, which are the central hall and the Salamlik, are usually decorated with marble, while the side rooms are decorated, are tiled with other materials, such as limecrete sometimes, but later on, while people got richer, they installed terracotta tiles or cemento tiles. So the standard central hall flooring is always made out of Carrara marble tiles, laid diagonally with, or not, sometimes not, but most of the time, yes, they have black lines in between to even enhance the effect of this diagonal layer. These tiles were pre-cut, imported from Carrara, so most of the times they have the same sizes in all those houses. And you can see as early as 1864 in this photo, you can see the floor pattern on this photo, which was made of Carrara marble, laid diagonally. So 1864, which means that, as we know, starting 1860, this marble was highly imported at very high scale. And you can see also some of the decoration on the wall here. Other floorings were the limecrete, which is on the bottom of image A. It's a sort of mortar made out of lime and aggregates, which is applied on the floor and then let to dry. The terracotta tiles, 20 by 20 tiles, which were installed on the side rooms, but to fix the door with the lock, they needed to have a piece of Carrara or a piece of Mansouriye tile, because the terracotta is it's not hard enough. C, you can see the limestone tiles, which are the Mansouriye, which we call ferni, mainly used in the kitchen because it's very hard and it's very good. And then later on, the limecrete flooring was replaced with cemento tiles, which are usually decorated. And you can see here old photos of the 19th century and early 20th century with those holes in their decoration as they were. This Beiruti house that you have seen here has inspired, of course, all other houses in the villages. And starting from the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, all the villages of Lebanon and over Lebanon, of course, to Jordan, Palestine, Syria, were covered with buildings of this type, which was called originally the Beiruti type, and then later on the Lebanese type. So today we call it, of course, the Lebanese house, and it's inspired from this Beiruti house, which emerged in the 1860s. This presentation that I have done was done here to really present those houses. It's just an introduction. Of course, my colleagues will go more and more into detail and show you those houses and the way to restore it. We are now open to questions if you wish.
Thank you, Fadlo. So the first question that we have, you just answered it actually, is what is the source of the three arches model, and did Lebanese mountains architecture inspire the Beiruti houses or vice versa?
So yes, we have seen that the three arches actually derive from the Liwan. It's a decorated type of Liwan with the columns and the arches, which developed from Renaissance architecture, where vertical lines were put in the facade to enhance the verticality and the elegance, rather than the large Iwan that was used before. And of course, it's the Beiruti house that was the major inspiration of the villages' houses of the late 19th and early 20th century.
The second question from Karen. She is writing an essay about this topic and would like to know if you can recommend a Lebanese house that she would be able to visit.
So Karen, get in touch, please, with the Beirut Heritage Initiative, and we will give you all the addresses we have and open all the doors we can open for you.
Third question. Do you think that the layout of the rooms in the houses was dedicated by the lifestyle of the people, or did it influence the lifestyle of the Beiruti residents later on?
What we can observe from social habits is that mainly originally in the farmhouses, people shared the same room, and the same room was used for many uses at the same time. So living and sleeping was done in the same rooms. And the houses were made of very, very little number of rooms because it was very expensive to build. When those houses expanded with the bourgeoisie, of course, the habits started changing, and the furniture also was introduced with West habits. chairs were introduced versus the original sofas, which were just cushions laid on the floor. So chairs were introduced, beds were introduced as well. And this needed, of course, more and more rooms. And those rooms were dedicated more and more to specific people and specific uses. What I know from my family habits is that the whole family, so the siblings, were all living together in the same house, each one occupying with his wife one of the rooms. And the unmarried sisters were also occupying one of the rooms. So the more the houses were built by adding rooms one to another in time. And really, it was only at the end of the 19th century when really families enriched a lot, that they were able to build houses from scratch totally with a specific number of rooms with dedicated spaces. Before, it was done really haphazard, little by little, as the wealth grew and the family grew. People really added on rooms by rooms and used those rooms as really multi-purpose. They slept in it, they lived in it, and it was really at the end of the 19th century that those rooms were dedicated specifically as bedrooms or living rooms, except, of course, for the main central hall and the salam.
A small request from one of our guests. Can Beirut Heritage Initiative organize a real-life Beirut Heritage House visit or lecture on this? It is so interesting.
Yes, of course, we can do that. Actually, now we are organizing this series of presentation to present the topic and to present the ways to preserve for all engineers and NGOs who are working on the ground in order to help them identify the material, because most of our engineers are trained and educated on reinforced concrete, but not at all on traditional techniques. So it's important to know that traditionally there was no concrete, and what was used was stone, lime, timber, and this is why we introduced this, and we will introduce, of course, the technology of restoring those buildings. We will also publish very soon a manual that will also is dedicated to the method of restoration of these Beiruti houses. There is a small presentation in the beginning, and then in detail how those houses, what are the materials, and how those materials should be respected and restored. And of course, we can organize a visit and workshops on sites.
Thank you. Are the limestone tiling still produced?
The limestone tiling, the Furni, is not produced anymore. It's very hard to find because the area of Mansouriya is today an industrial area. So it's no longer available as a career, as a stone, to extract stone. It's very rare to find today Mansouriya blocks. And if ever, it's industrially cut in 2 or 3 centimeters. So it doesn't have the same solidity as the old tiles that were hand cut with thicknesses ranging between 8 centimeters and 15 centimeters sometimes.
What is the type of black marble used as strips in the hall between Carrara marble?
The black, what I know is that, actually nobody knows, but officially, but what I know from marble producers is that it is Belgium black. So it's a Belgium marble that is totally black. And sometimes other black marble from Italy were used also. But what's interesting in this black marble from Belgium is that it's totally black without practically very few impurities and very few white lines. It's also very rare, and today local suppliers do not supply it anymore.
Can the Lebanese houses be found in other Arab countries? And if yes, is it called also the Beiruti house?
It used to be called the Beiruti house in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yes, it can be found in Arab countries, in Syria, northern Syria, in Lediyeh, in Tartus, as well as in Palestine, all along the coast. And sometimes as far as Mersin in Turkey, this type of house can be found and was called the Beiruti house, yes.
Do we know why the majority of the houses were designed with 3 arches and not 2 or 4 arches, for example?
In Beirut, it's most of 99% of the houses were designed on 3 arches, and this comes from the Renaissance model where you don't have a column in the center, so it's an uneven number to have an opening in the middle, and 3 derives from the Renaissance models, as we have seen also in Renaissance and late Ottoman models as well. Now, sometimes some houses had 5 arches on the facade. Major, larger houses had 5 arches on the facade. But in the mountains, we can find houses with 2 arches or 4 arches, but it's usually not really elegant because in the center of the central hall, you have a column, so it's blocked inside of being open through a central arch.
Why is the cedar wood called otrane? Is it because it was treated by otran?
Okay, actually, it's interesting to know that the cedar forests of Lebanon were protected since Roman times. So it was not local cedar that was used in construction. Actually, our forests in Lebanon are not wide enough and were not wide enough at the time to provide enough material for construction. So with the expansion of Beirut, timber was imported from Turkey, Anatolia, and from the Eastern Ottoman Empire, and mainly Lebanese cedar wood from the forests of Anatolia. And this I investigated to know why is it called Otrani. In Turkey, it doesn't mean a thing, so it's not a Turkish word. It's a word actually that is used in Greek, in Greece. In Greek, cedar is Otrani, and this is why probably it was transferred to Greece to Lebanon, and this is why we call it Otrani today. This is what I know. I cannot certify 100%, but from my researches and my investigations, this is where I am today. Again, as I have told you earlier, we know little because those details have not been written. And really, what's interesting today is that many researchers have written on the social expansion of Beirut and have described the Lebanese of the Beiruti house, but not in so many details. So we need really to investigate more and more to be able to write our architectural history.
Is it possible to have BHI's opinion, assessment, guidance of a similar building outside of Beirut? And how often is it to find such buildings that were not for residential purposes and therefore with slight difference in partitioning?
This Beiruti type that was established starting 1860 eventually gave way to a specific Lebanese style with the central 3 or 5 arches and the central hall. And of course, this type of building is very well adapted to public buildings, schools, hospitals, official buildings as well. So we can see municipal halls like the Junior Municipal Hall that is based on a central hall, which was a courtyard initially and then was closed and covered. So the Beirut Heritage Initiative has only today one purpose mainly, which is to try and help rebuild back the Beirut neighborhoods that were affected by the blast. This is our role, this is our mission, and after that, we don't know if this initiative will go on later on. History will tell. So we are focusing today on Beirut. We are not a very large team. We are very dedicated and focused team, but focused on rebuilding the houses of Beirut and the neighborhoods of Beirut. So we cannot engage today in larger missions, but of course it's interesting, and we are open to any partnership with other NGOs, other associations who would be ready to study more and more this specific architecture in all the details. As I have shown you, it's not an architecture of hazard. It's an architecture that has been conceived very well by professional builders. We have seen those rules of proportions that were used. So it's implemented in a very specific way at a time where there were no graduate architects. So these people who built these buildings either were architects that came from Istanbul, maybe Armenian architects from Istanbul, or European architects that came to Beirut. But again, we don't know because up to this day, I have never read any name of any architect for those buildings. Even the major, larger buildings, we don't know the names, and only suppositions of who might have been the builder. Someone from Istanbul, some say, oh no, we had an architect from Italy, but nobody knows in reality.
Thank you. How would you say the architecture of the traditional house represents Beirut's identity?
It represents very much Beirut identity because Beirut was what was Beirut before 1850 has totally disappeared today. There is no trace of the center city. Modern urban expansion, then the war, the civil war, then the Solidar experience erased totally what was the Beirut before that. So what we know of Beirut today is through these central hall houses that were developed after 1850 and 1860, and whatever survived of this architecture and the photos of this period. So yes, I think the reaction of the Beiruti people and the Lebanese people after August 4th, the blast, the reaction showed that really those heritage houses represent the soul and the spirit of Beirut, because most of us identify to Beirut through this model. It's a very easy, simple, direct image, and because it exists specifically here in Beirut, and if it's anywhere else in Lebanon, it's not at the same scale. It represents really the Beirut house and Beirut as a city. This is why we are trying to list it, to have the Ministry of Culture predict a law to protect those buildings and this heritage, because it's the history of Beirut and it should not be erased. It doesn't mean that it should not allow at the same time development of the city. The city has developed and overdeveloped the areas that were previously full of those Beiruti houses. So today, because those buildings are more rare, it is time today to find a way to preserve those houses in a comprehensive urban plan, in a comprehensive economical plan as well.
Why don't we make a professional documentary film with 3D animations to preserve this information?
Great. If you are a professional producer or a movie maker or whatever, yes, we are open to do that. If you have the talent and the capabilities. At the Beirut Heritage Initiative, we are really overwhelmed with work on the site, with also the manuals that you are producing. So, and we are, as I'm telling you, a very small team. We don't have big financial possibilities. Whatever money we have, we're putting it to restore houses. So most of us are volunteers in this field. And so, yes, we are open to any collaboration with any goodwill person who would want to produce such a thing.
In the current climate, what are the key challenges faced in championing the restoration and preservation of the Beiruti houses today?
Things were very, very hard during the 1990s. 2000 up until 2010. Starting 2010, the Ministry of Culture started looking at all demolition permits that were presented and rejected as many permits as possible. However, since there is no formal law to protect and list those buildings, it's also possible today for any building owner or landowner to ask for the demolition and to obtain in court the demolition authorization of his buildings. So we are not really, the situation is still very difficult today. However, the economic catastrophe and the solidarity that was expressed after August 4 allows us to think that this is a time today to really work all together to force whatever public authority is existing today to reevaluate the urban planning of Beirut, the master plan of Beirut, because preserving those buildings can only be done through a master plan. The goal is not to preserve individual buildings, it's to preserve clusters, it's to preserve a way of living, which is typical to Beirut. And we can only do that through a comprehensive master plan and really a revised urban plan for Beirut. The basis of that exists today, and at BHI we are also working on preparing workshops to really go through whatever ideas on master planning were produced. All the sources will be looked at, and ideas for a framework towards a master plan will be produced out of it.
Thank you. This is it for today.
I want to thank each and every person who attended today, because really it was a big challenge for us, and it's a great honor to have so many people attending this presentation. And of course, whoever wants to contact us, to volunteer with us, or to benefit from whatever expertise we have, you are all welcome. We are here really to preserve and help pushing forward the idea of preserving Beirut's heritage. Thank you again, and see you soon.